The room didn't explode when the accusation surfaced. No shouting, no dramatic press conference. Just a sentence, delivered quietly, that didn't seem to belong in the world it landed in. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. He targeted my daughter. That's the line people keep repeating. Not because it's loud, but because it's almost unbearably specific. And because it arrived only after everyone who could directly deny it was already gone. Here's the contradiction that sits at the center of this story, and it's one we're going to have to live with for a while. If the allegation is true, it is devastating. If it is false, it is catastrophic. And if it sits somewhere in between, shaped by memory, silence, fear, and time, then it may be the most dangerous version of all. Because this didn't come out during a trial. It didn't emerge during an investigation. It didn't surface when cameras were ready and lawyers were lined up. It came months after a double homicide. Months after Rob Reiner and his wife were found dead inside their own home. Months after their son was arrested and charged. Months after the story, in the public mind, had already hardened into something simpler, cleaner, easier to categorize. Family tragedy, mental health crisis, a violent rupture with no deeper backstory required. And then, quietly, another story began to push against that version. It didn't start with evidence. It didn't start with documents. It started with a man who had spent decades controlling his public image, choosing, very deliberately, to stop doing that. Clint Eastwood has never been known for impulsive confession. He is not a man who rushes to microphones. He is not a figure who benefits from chaos. His entire career, his entire persona, has been built on something closer to restraint. Distance. Precision. Which is why the timing of this matters. Why now? Why after death? Why after arrest? Why after silence became irreversible? Those questions don't accuse anyone, but they refuse to go away. This story matters right now not because it reopens an old wound, but because it challenges the story that was allowed to close too quickly. It asks whether what we thought we understood about that violent night was ever complete, or whether it was simply convenient. Because when people talk about this case, they usually start with the son. They talk about motive. They talk about rage. They talk about instability. They talk about the moment everything snapped. But what if that moment didn't begin that night? What if it began years earlier, in private rooms, in unspoken boundaries, in situations no one wanted to name because naming them would have cost too much? I want to be careful here. We all should be. An accusation is not a verdict. A claim is not a conviction. And silence is not proof. But silence is not nothing either. Especially when it stretches across decades. Especially when it is held by people powerful enough to speak and chooses not to. Eastwood's accusation is not framed as a rumor. He does not describe it as something he heard third hand. He frames it as something he believes he understands intimately. Something personal. Something he says he protected his family from by keeping it private. That framing is doing a lot of work, and it raises uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to protect someone by staying quiet? At what point does protection become complicity? And how many people can be harmed by a silence that was never neutral to begin with? There's another reason this story matters now. Because when violence happens inside a family, the public instinct is to isolate it, to seal it off from broader context, to treat it as an aberration rather than a culmination. But families do not rupture in a vacuum. They fracture along fault lines that often go unnoticed until pressure makes them visible. And when those fault lines involve power, access, and unspoken authority, the damage doesn't always look like conflict. Sometimes it looks like compliance, or confusion, or years of behavior that never quite makes sense until much later. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable to sit with. Because Eastwood's accusation does not simply recast Rob Reiner. It potentially reframes everyone around him, including the people who didn't act, the people who didn't ask, and the people who may have sensed something was wrong but couldn't quite articulate what that something was. And then there's the number, 23. Eastwood repeats it with a precision that makes people uneasy. Not because numbers are inherently true, but because trauma often clings to specifics. Dates, counts, locations, details that don't fade the way emotions do. But where did that number come from? Memory? Documentation? Confession? Or repetition over time until it calcified into certainty? We're not going to answer that yet. We can't, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What we can do is sit with the fact that numbers like that don't appear accidentally in accusations of this magnitude. They are either anchored to something real, or they represent something far more psychological. An attempt to impose order on an experience that never had any. And that distinction matters, because it determines whether this is a story about a hidden crime, or about the way unresolved trauma can ripple outward, intersecting with tragedy in ways no one intended. Here's another contradiction worth holding. If this allegation had surfaced earlier, it would have changed everything. Investigations, relationships, decisions. If it had surfaced earlier, perhaps there would have been accountability. Or perhaps there would have been denial, litigation, and character assassination. We don't know. But it didn't surface earlier. It surfaced after blood had already been spilled, which means whatever truth exists here now exists in a compromised state, contaminated by grief, by guilt, by the human instinct to search backward for explanations once the damage is irreversible. That doesn't invalidate the claim, but it does complicate it. And complication is where this story lives. Because this is not just about what Clint Eastwood says happened. It's about why he says he didn't say it sooner. It's about what that silence may have cost. And it's about whether the justice system, or the public, is even equipped to handle accusations that arrive this late, this heavy, and this entangled with a separate act of violence. As we move forward, you'll notice something. There are no clean villains here. No simple timelines. No moment where everything clicks neatly into place. Instead, there are overlapping narratives, conflicting incentives, and people who may all believe, sincerely, that they are telling the truth, even when those truths cannot coexist. So let me ask you something, and don't answer it too quickly. If someone stays silent for decades to protect their child, and that silence indirectly contributes to a later tragedy, was that silence still protection? Or was it something else entirely? Because according to Eastwood, the reason he stayed quiet was not fear of the industry, not fear of lawsuits, not fear of public backlash. It was fear of what speaking would do to his family. But what he claims to have discovered later is that silence did something too. And that realization, that silence itself may have been part of the damage, is where this story truly begins. Because once that idea takes hold, it forces a question that no one involved can escape. What if the violence everyone focused on was not the beginning of the story at all, but the final consequence of something no one wanted to name? And if that's even partially true, then what comes next won't just challenge what we think we know about that night. It will challenge who we believe failed long before it. What if the moment everyone focused on wasn't the moment everything changed? That question sat unanswered in the days after the killings. It still does. Because the night Rob Reiner and his wife were found dead has been described so many times that it now feels familiar. Almost rehearsed. A domestic tragedy. A sudden eruption. The kind of story people think they understand the moment they hear it. But familiarity is not the same thing as clarity. And when you slow the timeline down, when you strip away the headlines and reconstruct the night frame by frame, something unsettling happens. The story stops behaving the way it's supposed to. The first reports were thin, deliberately so. Law enforcement released only what they had to. 2 bodies. A private residence. A call placed late in the evening. Responding officers. No immediate threat to the public. Within hours, the name surfaced. Nick Reiner. Not a stranger. Not a burglar. Not an unknown assailant. A son. That single fact shaped everything that followed. Because once a crime is framed as intrafamilial, the public mind starts doing something very specific. It compresses. It simplifies. It looks for pathology. It looks for instability. It looks for the one moment where someone snapped. And that framing is powerful. It directs attention inward, away from context, away from history, away from anything that might complicate the narrative. But here's what didn't happen that night. There was no chase, no barricade, no standoff that unfolded on live television. According to investigators, Nick Reiner was taken into custody without incident. Calm enough, some accounts say, to answer basic questions. Calm enough to comply. Calm enough to confuse the expectations people had already formed in their heads. That calm is not evidence of innocence. But it's not evidence of chaos either. And that's where the first crack appears. Because violent crimes driven by sudden rage tend to leave a specific kind of residue. Disarray. Incoherence. A trail of impulsive decisions that don't quite line up. But early reports suggested something else entirely. A contained scene, a narrow window of action, a beginning and an end that appeared, disturbingly, deliberate. Still, the story moved quickly. By the next morning, the phrase double homicide had settled into place. By the end of the week, the charges followed. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Premeditation. That word matters. Not legally. We'll get to that later, but narratively. Because premeditation implies time, thought, a build-up, a before. And yet, the public conversation rushed past that implication as if it were a technicality. Because it was easier to focus on what happened than on why it might have been building. Inside the house, details were scarce. Investigators cited the ongoing nature of the case. Neighbors reported nothing unusual in the hours leading up to the incident. No raised voices. No visible confrontation. No public unraveling. That absence is important. Not because it proves anything, but because it contradicts the story people were already telling themselves. The idea of a loud argument. The idea of a breaking point. The idea of a sudden emotional collapse. None of that was visible. Instead, what we have is a night that appears, at least on the surface, disturbingly quiet. And quiet doesn't make for comfortable explanations. Within days, commentary filled the vacuum. Anonymous sources, former acquaintances, armchair psychologists. Everyone seemed eager to explain Nick Reiner in a way that made the violence legible. Mental health struggles were mentioned. Estrangement was implied. Pressure, expectations, the weight of legacy. All plausible, all familiar. But notice what those explanations have in common. They keep the story self-contained. They don't require us to look at anyone else. And that's not an accident. Because families with power, especially families with cultural power, tend to be narrated inward. The assumption is that whatever went wrong must have originated inside the unit itself. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the house that night was not the origin of the violence, but the endpoint of something that had been moving, slowly and invisibly, for years? At the time, no one was asking that out loud. And there were reasons for that. The investigation was ongoing. The victims were respected. The accused was a son. There was a natural instinct, even among journalists, to tread carefully. But careful can slide into incurious. And incurious is where stories calcify. Because while attention remained fixed on Nick Reiner's state of mind, other questions went largely untouched. Questions like, who knew what and when? What conversations had happened privately long before that night? What grievances had been dismissed as misunderstandings? What tensions had been normalized because acknowledging them would have been too disruptive? These are not questions that point to guilt. They point to context. And context, in cases like this, is often the most uncomfortable thing to examine. Then came the silence. Not just the expected legal silence, but something heavier, something emotional. Friends of the family declined to speak. Industry figures offered condolences, not commentary. Statements were brief, controlled, polite. No one wanted to speculate. And yet, speculation filled the void anyway. Because when violence erupts in a family that has spent decades presenting stability, people search for an explanation that preserves the myth. They want the rupture to be anomalous, isolated, a single bad actor, a single bad night. That narrative protects everyone else. But months later, when Clint Eastwood spoke, when he framed the story differently, it forced a re-evaluation of that instinct. Because Eastwood wasn't talking about a single night. He was talking about a pattern. Not a pattern of violence, a pattern of silence. And silence changes how we see that night. Because if something was known, or suspected, or feared long before the killings, then the violence stops looking like a lightning strike. It starts looking like a delayed consequence. Again, that does not assign blame. It assigns responsibility to ask harder questions. Let's pause on something else that often gets overlooked. The charges. First-degree murder requires the state to argue intent formed before the act. Not in the moment. Not during an argument. Before. That alone suggests investigators believe there was more than an emotional outburst at play, more than a loss of control. Yet publicly, that aspect of the case was barely discussed. It didn't fit the dominant narrative. Because premeditation forces us to imagine planning. And planning forces us to imagine motive that didn't arise overnight. So what motive did investigators see? At the time, we didn't know. And in many ways, we still don't. But what we do know is that motive is rarely singular. especially in family crimes. It is usually layered, accumulated, built from moments that seemed insignificant when they occurred. A comment dismissed, a boundary crossed, a truth avoided. And when Clint Eastwood later suggested that something deeply personal had been kept quiet for decades, it cast those layers in a different light. Because if Nick Reiner believed something had happened, believed it deeply, emotionally, viscerally, then that belief itself becomes part of the motive landscape. Even if it cannot be proven, even if it cannot be verified, belief is not truth. But belief can still shape action. This is where things get uncomfortable. Because once you introduce the possibility that the violence was informed by a long-held belief, one that may or may not have been validated, you are forced to confront the limits of investigation itself. How do you investigate something no one spoke about? How do you charge around a secret that was never filed, never documented, never litigated? And how do you separate truth from narrative once death has erased the possibility of direct confrontation? These questions don't have satisfying answers, and that's precisely why they matter. In the immediate aftermath of the killings, the story was allowed to settle. The public moved on. The case entered the slow machinery of the legal system. And for a while, that seemed like the end of it. Until it wasn't. Because months later, when Eastwood framed his accusation, he didn't just accuse a man. He implicitly accused a system, a culture. That allowed something to remain unspoken until it was too late to matter in the way it should have. That reframing forces us back to the night itself. Back to the calm arrest. Back to the quiet house. Back to the absence of chaos. And it raises a question that no one asked then, but that cannot be avoided now. What if Nick Reiner didn't act in a moment of sudden madness? What if he acted at the end of a long internal argument, one that no one else was willing to have out loud? And if that's even possible, then the next thing we have to examine is not the crime scene, but the son no one was really watching. Everyone keeps asking the same question about him. What was wrong with Nick Reiner? It's an understandable instinct. When violence erupts inside a family, the gaze snaps immediately to the person who acted. Psychology becomes the lens. Pathology becomes the shorthand. Something must have been broken. Something must have failed. But that question, what was wrong with him, may already be leading us in the wrong direction. Because it assumes Nick Reiner was the center of the story. And everything we've learned since suggests he may have been standing on the edge of it. Nick Reiner did not live his life under a spotlight. That's important. Not in a sentimental way, but in a structural one. He was not groomed for public attention. He was not positioned as a successor. He was not someone whose identity was reinforced by constant external validation. He existed in the negative space of prominence, close enough to feel its gravity, far enough to feel its absence. Being the child of Rob Reiner meant that expectations hovered even when they were never spoken. And when expectations aren't articulated, they don't disappear, they become ambient. Harder to confront, harder to escape. People who knew the family described Nick as quiet. That word comes up again and again. Quiet, reserved, private, not withdrawn in a dramatic sense, just contained. And containment can mean many things. Sometimes it means stability. Sometimes it means avoidance. Sometimes it means carrying something without knowing where to put it. There's a temptation to read backward from the crime and reinterpret every aspect of his personality as a warning sign. That temptation should be resisted, not because it's unfair to him, but because it distorts the truth. Most people who commit violence do not advertise it in advance. What matters more is not whether Nick seemed unstable, but whether he seemed unseen. Here's what we know and what we don't. Nick Reiner was not estranged in the way tabloids often imply. He was present, involved to a degree, not entirely outside the family orbit, but not fully integrated either. That middle position is psychologically treacherous. You are close enough to know when something is off, but not close enough to challenge it. People in that position often become observers rather than participants. They notice patterns. They pick up on tension. They sense when conversations stop the moment they enter the room. And when no one explains why, the mind fills in the gaps. There were no public reports of violent behavior prior to the killings. No criminal history. No pattern of escalation that would have alerted outsiders to imminent danger. That absence matters, because it suggests that whatever was. There's another detail that rarely gets discussed. Nick Reiner was an adult, which means that if something occurred years earlier, something involving his sister, something involving someone he was expected to respect. He may have learned about it later. Indirectly. Fragmented. Through implication rather than confession. Those are the most dangerous kinds of revelations. Not because they are necessarily false, but because they are incomplete. Incomplete information invites obsession. It invites reconstruction. It invites the mind to replay scenes it never witnessed, trying to make them make sense. And when those scenes involve power imbalances, when they involve someone revered by the family, the cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable. How do you reconcile admiration with suspicion? How do you challenge a figure everyone else protects? How do you act when acting feels impossible? Silence answers those questions by doing nothing. Until it doesn't. There's something else worth sitting with. Nick Reiner was not the one who spoke publicly after the accusations surfaced. He has not issued statements. He has not attempted to justify himself in the court of public opinion. That silence could mean many things. Legal advice, emotional shutdown, or something more complex. The realization that whatever story he carries will never be heard on its own terms. Because once Clint Eastwood spoke, the narrative shifted. Nick was no longer just a defendant. He became, in some eyes, a possible reactor rather than an initiator. That reframing is uncomfortable. It doesn't absolve him, but it complicates the story in ways people aren't eager to engage with. And yet, that complication may be the key. Consider this. If Nick Reiner believed his father had crossed a line that shattered the family's moral foundation, then every subsequent interaction would be filtered through that belief. Every dinner, every silence, every moment of normalcy would feel performative. Living inside that dissonance can be corrosive, especially if the person at the center of the belief remains untouchable. And Rob Reiner was untouchable in many ways. Respected, influential, protected by reputation. That doesn't mean he was guilty of what Eastwood later alleged. It means that challenging him, even raising the possibility of wrongdoing, would have felt impossible for someone in Nick's position. Which raises a question that feels almost taboo. If Nick Reiner believed something terrible had happened, and believed no one else would ever act, did he see himself as the only person who could? That question is not an excuse. It is not a justification. It is a window into a mindset that law enforcement often struggles to account for, because the legal system is built around acts. But violence is often built around narratives. The story someone tells themselves about what must be done. And once that internal narrative hardens, outside reality has very little influence left. We don't know when, or even if, Nick Reiner formed such a narrative. We don't know how complete it was. We don't know whether it was challenged, contradicted, or reinforced by others. What we do know is that the public story ignored that possibility entirely. It was easier to label him unstable, easier to isolate the violence, easier to move on. But now, with Eastwood's accusation hanging in the air, the old explanation feels insufficient. Because if the violence was the end of a long internal reckoning, rather than the beginning of one, then understanding Nick Reiner requires us to look not just at his psychology, but at his environment, at what was spoken, at what was avoided, at what was protected at all costs. And that brings us to the most difficult part of this chapter. The possibility that Nick Reiner wasn't the only one who sensed something was wrong, but he may have been the only one who couldn't live with the silence anymore. If that's even partially true, then the story doesn't pivot on madness. It pivots on isolation. And isolation, when combined with certainty, even mistaken certainty, can be far more dangerous than chaos. Because chaos burns out. Certainty does not. As we move forward, the question will shift again. Not from what Nick did. That is already being adjudicated, but from what he believed. And more importantly, who knew what he believed and chose not to intervene. Because if there were warning signs, they weren't explosive. They were quiet. And quiet warnings are the easiest to miss. Or ignore. You've hit your limit. Please try again later. Retry. Clint Eastwood's voice broke the pattern of silence in a way that nobody could ignore. Not because he shouted it from a stage. Not because he released a public statement designed to dominate headlines. Because he didn't. He spoke carefully, precisely, with that slow, deliberate cadence that carries weight even when the words themselves are explosive. He targeted my daughter, he said. 3 words. Yet enough to shift the frame of everything we thought we knew. What does that mean exactly? It means that after decades of silence, After careful calculation, after decades of choosing what to protect and what to ignore, Eastwood made a choice. A choice to speak. And that choice was terrifying in its implications. Because when someone like Clint Eastwood accuses someone like Rob Reiner of a betrayal this intimate, it doesn't exist in isolation. It reframes every relationship around it, every perception of that family, every understanding of the events that led to tragedy. We need to be deliberate here. Accusation is not verdict. Statement is not evidence. But silence is never neutral. And Eastwood's silence had been decades long. Think about that for a moment. Decades. Years in which nothing was said, no warning offered, no public sign. That is a weight, a presence. And when it lands after violence, it changes the way you see everything that came before. Because silence does two things simultaneously. It protects and it obscures. It preserves and it conceals. It shields and it allows harm to fester in the shadows. When Eastwood finally spoke, he didn't just target Rob Reiner. He implicitly targeted the system of protection that had allowed decades of secrecy. He targeted the people who had avoided questions, the people who had assumed that because nothing had surfaced, nothing had happened. This is what makes the accusation so destabilizing. It doesn't fit neatly into our cultural understanding of crime, morality, or family dynamics. It refuses the usual comfort of simplicity. There are no easy villains, no single night to point to, no moment of explosive revelation, only patterns, accumulation, and long-held silence finally breaking. And that brings us to the next layer of tension, the number 23. Clint Eastwood, in that same measured tone, specifies the number 23. Not several, not many, 23. The precision is deliberate, almost ritualistic, because specificity demands acknowledgement. It refuses to be ignored. Numbers like that do something dangerous to a story. They make the abstract concrete. They turn impression into perceived fact. They sharpen our sense of outrage, disbelief, or horror, depending on the lens through which we view it. But what does it mean? Where did it come from? From memory? Documentation? Conversations long erased? Or is it, as some might suspect, the mind's attempt to impose order on chaos? That distinction matters. Not just for accuracy, but for understanding the emotional architecture of this story. Because trauma is rarely neat. Trauma accumulates. It fractures memory. It creates a rhythm of anticipation and dread. And when it is finally spoken aloud, it lands like a hammer. But a hammer shaped by decades of restraint. Then there's the context of timing. Why now? Why after the deaths? Why after the son had been arrested, charged, and the story had solidified in public consciousness as a tragic but contained event? Timing is never accidental in accusations of this magnitude. Speak too early, and legal complications, social repercussions, and disbelief can cloud the message. Speak too late, and people accuse you of opportunism. Eastwood, we are told, chose the moment with care. And that choice reframes the night of violence entirely. It suggests that perhaps what happened inside the Reiner household was not the starting point. That perhaps it was the endpoint of decades of unseen tension, unacknowledged violations, boundaries crossed and left unexamined. Imagine living in a household where the unspoken is more powerful than the spoken word, where fear, respect, or loyalty prevents you from raising your hand, opening your mouth, or naming reality. Now imagine the consequences of that silence finally colliding with action. That is where we start to understand Nick Reiner's position. He may not have been the architect of history, but he may have been the reactor to it. And when he reacted, it forced us all, the public, the industry, the family, the press, to confront a past we had assumed was closed. Because the real power of Eastwood's accusation is that it demands reconsideration of everything. The son, the father, the mother, the extended family, the bystanders, the silence. Every relationship, every decision, every choice suddenly exists on a continuum between what was visible and what was hidden, between what we assumed and what actually happened, between protection and complicity, which is why this story is so uncomfortable. Because it isn't just a crime. It isn't just a death. It isn't just an allegation. It's the collision of long-held secrets with irreversible consequences. And when secrets finally speak, they do not whisper. They echo. The problem is that when an accusation lands this late, it interacts with the narrative that has already hardened. The one where Nick Reiner is the actor, the son, the perpetrator. The one where tragedy is a discrete event rather than the climax of a long story. Eastwood's claim stretches that narrative into something far more complex. It forces the question, what if this wasn't just about one night? What if the real story began decades earlier, hidden in plain sight, shaped by decisions, omissions, and protective silences? And then there's the final, unnerving thought. If all this is even partially true, then the violence we witnessed may have been only a symptom. The real injury, the true rupture, was happening silently for years, in rooms no one noticed, in conversations no one recorded, in boundaries that were crossed and never named. The ripple effects are almost impossible to map. Which brings us to the point that everyone will eventually have to reckon with. The son was not acting in isolation. He was reacting to a constellation of events. Decisions made decades before, by people who may have believed they were protecting their children. By people who assumed that silence was the safest choice. By people who underestimated the weight of what remained unspoken. And when Eastwood spoke, that constellation suddenly became visible. Every observer, every family member, every friend now had to reconsider their assumptions. Because what had been invisible was now, impossibly, unavoidable. And the question that lingers over the entire story, the one that shapes every chapter to come, is this. What happens when long-held silence collides with violence, accusation, and revelation? And who ultimately bears responsibility for the truths that were never allowed to surface? The accusation hung in the air like a storm that had been brewing for decades, silent but heavy. Clint Eastwood did not just throw words into a vacuum. He placed them deliberately, with the weight of experience, history, and observation behind them. And in doing so, he reframed everything we thought we knew about the Reiner family, about the night of the tragedy, and about the decades that preceded it. The focus shifted, inevitably, to Rob Reiner. A man respected in Hollywood, in the public eye, in his own home. A figure whose career had long shielded him from casual scrutiny. He was not just a director or actor, he was an institution. Which is precisely what made the accusation so destabilizing. Because to accuse someone of that stature of betrayal, of boundary violations, and of acts against a minor in the household is to challenge the architecture of respect itself. And yet, the accusation was not made lightly. Eastwood did not sensationalize. He did not reduce the claim to clickbait. He spoke carefully, acknowledging the gravity of speaking out decades after the events. He framed it as protection of family, protection of the truth, protection of memory. But protection, as we know, is rarely neutral. Think about what it means to protect by staying silent. To sit on knowledge that could prevent harm, but choosing not to reveal it. To prioritize privacy or preservation over confrontation. To assume that shielding others from the truth is more important than confronting wrongdoing. And then consider the consequences of that silence. The night Rob and Michelle Reiner were killed was framed publicly as an eruption. A son, in a moment of extreme violence, reacting in a way that shocked everyone. And in some ways, that is true. But the moment itself cannot be understood without looking at the decades of context that preceded it. Nick Reiner, the son, did not act in isolation. His understanding of events, his perception of right and wrong, his decisions, all were informed by years of observing, absorbing, and internalizing dynamics he was never allowed to confront openly. We cannot know exactly what he believed, and we may never know. But belief shapes action, and perception can drive consequences as surely as fact. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Families with power often rely on silence as currency. Not just public silence, but private silence. Knowledge is held tightly, conversations are avoided, and grievances are deferred. Everyone learns, implicitly, that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. And in households like this, the cost of speaking can feel catastrophic. Reputation, relationships, emotional stability, all are at stake. Which is why Eastwood's timing matters. He did not speak before the tragedy. He did not intervene in ways that would have prevented the night of the murders. Or at least, he claims he did not. He waited. He measured. He observed. And only after events had unfolded in irreversible ways did he reveal what he had known. That decision is both understandable and destabilizing. It forces us to confront what we are willing to tolerate in silence. It forces us to ask, does protecting a family member excuse an action against wrongdoing? Or does it make an action part of the harm itself? Because what Eastwood revealed is not just an allegation against Rob Reiner. It is a critique of a system. A family system, a Hollywood system, a culture of unspoken rules that allowed abuse, boundary violations, or betrayals to persist unexamined, and the specificity of his claim adds to the gravity. 23 times, he said. 23. The number is precise. It is almost ritualistic. Trauma often clings to numbers. They are anchors in memory, beacons in the fog of recollection. Whether the number is exact or symbolic, it communicates something undeniable: repetition, pattern, continuity. Not a single lapse in judgment, but a series of acts that accumulate significance over time. The question we have to grapple with is this: how did decades of observation, silence, and unspoken awareness shape Nick Reiner's understanding of the household? And to what extent did that understanding inform the tragic events that followed? When people discuss family violence, they often focus on the act itself, the eruption, the moment, the crime scene. But rarely do they examine the decades of context, the hidden histories, the quiet tensions that set the stage. And yet, those hidden histories may be the most instructive, because they reveal that violence is rarely spontaneous. It is often the endpoint of prolonged emotional, psychological, or moral tension. It is the culmination of unaddressed grievances, unchallenged power dynamics, and unspoken knowledge. Consider this: if Nick Reiner acted on a belief, even a partially formed belief, about his father's conduct, then the murder cannot be understood without considering what he believed, when he believed it, and why he thought no one else would act. Belief is a powerful motivator. It can distort perception, amplify fear, and catalyze action. And when that belief collides with inaction from the very people who could have intervened, guardians, friends, observers, adults who had authority, the result can be catastrophic. And yet, even in the face of such complexity, the public narrative preferred simplicity. One son, one act, one night of tragedy. That narrative is comforting, but incomplete. Eastwood's revelation disrupts that narrative. It forces us to revisit what we assumed, to question what we were told, and to consider the long arc of events that made the tragedy possible. It also forces us to examine the role of the bystanders, the silent observers, the people who chose privacy, family unity, or professional decorum over confrontation. Because inaction has consequences, and when the stakes involve children, betrayal, or violation, those consequences are profound. The story, then, is not linear. It is not simply a crime story, nor a scandal. It is an exploration of human psychology under conditions of secrecy, respect, and unspoken authority. It is an examination of how long-held silence can shape perception, influence behavior, and, ultimately, intersect with catastrophic outcomes. And yet, despite all of this, questions remain. Was Eastwood's accusation wholly accurate? Partially accurate? Misinterpreted in hindsight? We cannot answer that definitively. But the fact that such a claim exists, articulated with precision and authority, shifts the lens through which every prior event must be viewed. And it raises a haunting question for everyone involved. What would have happened if someone had spoken sooner? Would the events of that fateful night have been prevented? Would relationships have been repaired, boundaries enforced, or harm mitigated? Or would intervention have simply delayed the inevitable collision of belief, frustration, and action? The answer is unknowable, but the question lingers. It hangs over the family, over the public understanding, over every retelling of the story. And that, in itself, is a revelation. Because stories that arrive late, after violence, carry a unique gravity. They are not just about what happened. They are about what was concealed, what was tolerated, and what, ultimately, shaped the behavior of everyone involved. And as we continue to explore the Reiner family, Nick, Rob, Michelle, and Clint Eastwood's perspective, we begin to see the edges of a story far larger and more intricate than the public ever realized. Edges that are still sharp, still dangerous, still capable of shifting everything we thought we understood about the events leading up to that night. The night that Clint Eastwood finally spoke changed the framing of the entire narrative, but it also raised a host of new questions that almost nobody in the public was ready to consider. Because when a man like Eastwood names someone like Rob Reiner in such a personal, specific way, it does more than accuse. It forces a re-examination of relationships, timelines, and loyalties that had long been taken for granted. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what it means to observe, to protect, and to fail to intervene. And it starts to shine. Think about living in a household where the unspoken is more powerful than the spoken, where adults make decisions about what can be named and what must be avoided, where knowledge is withheld to protect, to preserve, or to avoid confrontation. It is in that environment that belief can become both protective and corrosive. Protective, because the family maintains a semblance of order and reputation. Corrosive, because unspoken truths ferment, distort, and create pressure points that can only manifest in catastrophic ways. Which brings us to the next crucial point: perception versus reality. Eastwood's accusation forces a confrontation between what is believed to have happened and what can be verified. That tension is uncomfortable, but essential. Because when an act of violence occurs, people naturally want a neat story: one actor, one moment, one clear cause. But reality is rarely that simple. The events in the Reiner household were shaped by decades of interaction, observation, and moral negotiation. The night of the tragedy was not an isolated eruption. It was the endpoint of a complex interplay of belief, secrecy, and perceived violations. And Eastwood's statement reframes that endpoint. It suggests that what was believed, even if unverified, may have driven the actions we now describe as tragedy. It also forces us to consider the role of adults who remained silent, who observed, suspected, or understood, and yet chose privacy, decorum, or protection over confrontation. Because inaction, in these contexts, carries consequences just as real as deliberate action. And that is why this story refuses to settle. It is not merely a crime story, not merely a tragedy, not merely an accusation. It is an exploration of the consequences of silence, the accumulation of unspoken knowledge, and the moral complexity of human relationships under pressure. Every layer of the Reiner family dynamic now needs to be reconsidered. Every assumption about the night of the murders, the relationships preceding it, and the psychological landscape in which they occurred is open to examination. And as we continue, one central tension will guide us. How long can silence protect, and at what point does it contribute to harm? Because if decades of silence intersect with belief, perception, and moral failure, the results can be devastating. And that is exactly what we need to understand if we are to make sense of the events that followed. The question that no one wants to answer is this: what did Michelle Reiner know? Her presence in the household was central, yet her voice is almost entirely absent from public discussion. And that absence, once we consider Clint Eastwood's revelation, is striking. Not because it implies guilt, not because it implies complicity, but because silence is meaningful, especially in families where protection and reputation are paramount. Michelle Reiner's life was intertwined with her husband's career, her son's upbringing, and the network of relationships that defined the household. She was, in many ways, the stabilizing force. The one who negotiated the tensions, smoothed over disputes, and maintained appearances. And yet, even in that role, she may have been aware of dynamics that could have predicted or even prevented the tragedy. Imagine what it's like to witness subtle shifts in behavior over years. Small reactions, patterns that repeat, moments of avoidance or tension that you sense but cannot name. And when those shifts involve someone you trust, someone you love, someone whose reputation is intertwined with your own social and professional world, what do you do? Do you confront it? Do you speak up? Or do you protect the family, maintain appearances, and hope that the internal tension will resolve itself? According to sources, Michelle Reiner was cautious, deliberate, and protective. She maintained boundaries and sought to shield both children from what she perceived as potential disruption. And that carefulness, while understandable, may have unintentionally contributed to the weight of unspoken truths. There are whispers from close associates, anonymous recollections, fragments of conversations, that suggest Michelle had noticed certain patterns, things that didn't add up, moments that made her uneasy. but she reportedly dismissed them as misperceptions, small misunderstandings, or private matters she couldn't address without destabilizing the family. That internal negotiation, balancing instinct with caution, illustrates a critical point about the story. The Reiner household was structured in such a way that silence was enforced not only by explicit authority, but by subtle social norms. The rules were clear. Do not challenge the figure at the center, do not name violations, do not expose the family to scandal. And those rules, when combined with the weight of belief, perception, and fear, can create an environment where actions are dictated more by avoidance than by conscious choice. Which brings us back to the son. Nick Reiner was operating within this environment. He observed, he internalized, he interpreted. And if Clint Eastwood's claims are accurate, then Nick was aware, or believed he was aware, of violations that were never named, never addressed, never resolved. He may have grown up with a sense that boundaries could be crossed, that authority figures were untouchable, and that some truths were too dangerous to speak. And living with that tension, over time, is psychologically corrosive. What does that look like? It looks like a quiet intensity, a sense of being constantly on alert, a hyper-awareness of what can and cannot be said, a perception of injustice without recourse. And in some cases, it manifests as reactive violence when the internal pressure becomes unbearable. None of this excuses the actions of Nick Reiner. Not legally, not morally, but it does frame them in a way that allows for understanding beyond the simplistic narrative of a sudden outburst. Eastwood's statement reframes everything, because now, the public is forced to consider that the tragedy was not an isolated incident, that it may have been the endpoint of a long arc of tension, fear, and unspoken knowledge. And the timing of the accusation itself adds another layer. Eastwood did not speak immediately. He did not intervene when the son was still in adolescence or early adulthood. He waited for decades, observing, measuring, protecting, and finally speaking only after violence had already occurred. That decision forces the audience to confront difficult questions. What is the cost of silence? How do protection and inaction intersect? And when does silence cease to shield and begin to contribute to harm? The gravity of the accusation is amplified by the specificity of the claim, 23 separate occurrences. The precision is unnerving. It turns abstract concern into something tangible. It is a count of acts, each carrying its own weight, each contributing to a cumulative pattern of behavior. And numbers like this, repeated over time, demand acknowledgement. They are not easily ignored, even in a world that prefers simplicity and closure. The narrative begins to expand, moving beyond the night of the tragedy and beyond the immediate actions of the son. It encompasses decades, spanning observation, belief, and unspoken understanding. Each layer adds complexity. The parents, the children, the bystanders, the industry, the reputation, the rules of silence. Each layer contributes to a context in which violence, when it finally erupted, became almost inevitable. And yet, even with all this complexity, there is still no definitive answer. We do not know the precise details of what was known or believed. We do not know the conversations that were never had. We do not know the moments where intervention might have changed the trajectory. All we know is that silence, belief, and perception collided with irreversible action. And that is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Because when Eastwood spoke, he did more than accuse a man. He forced a reckoning with decades of silence, of assumptions, and of unspoken moral calculus. He forced everyone to ask, what happens when protection becomes complicity? And as we continue, we will explore those layers in detail. The decisions, the patterns, the subtle tensions that no one could articulate until long after tragedy had struck. The story of the Reiner family is not linear. It is not neat. It does not resolve with the night of the murders. It begins long before, and it echoes far beyond. And now, with Eastwood's revelation, we begin to see just how far the ripples extend. The focus shifts inevitably to Rob Reiner. He is the figure at the center of the storm, both literally and figuratively. A respected filmmaker, actor, and public personality whose reputation has been carefully cultivated over decades. In the public eye, he is untouchable. In the private household, he is the authority figure around whom boundaries, expectations, and behavior are negotiated, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly. And that is precisely why Eastwood's accusation is so destabilizing. Because to allege, decades after the fact, that someone of that stature engaged in repeated violations within a family is to challenge not just the individual, but the structures of power, authority, and perception that surround him. It is to suggest that the very architecture of the household, the social rules, the unspoken norms, the silences enforced by respect and fear, may have contributed to the circumstances that culminated in tragedy. Eastwood frames the allegation with precision, stating not only that violations occurred, but that they occurred repeatedly, 23 times. That specificity is alarming, not necessarily as a literal tally, but as a signal of pattern, of repetition, of ongoing behavior that was observed, noted, and remembered. And here is the critical point. Repetition implies awareness. Awareness implies potential accountability. And yet, for decades, those acts remained unspoken, concealed by silence, shielded by reputation, and perhaps rationalized by those who observed them as being too uncomfortable to confront. That is the heart of the story. It is not merely an allegation of wrongdoing. It is a meditation on silence, power, and perception. It asks, when people know or suspect harm, but choose inaction, what is the moral weight of that choice? And what happens when inaction collides with belief, fear, and the psychological pressure that accumulates over decades? Consider the environment in which these events allegedly took place. The Reiner household, like many families with prominence, operated under a set of implicit rules. Boundaries were enforced by respect for reputation. Discussions that might challenge authority were deferred or avoided. Knowledge was withheld in the name of protection, protection of children, protection of family, protection of public image. But protection is never neutral. It shapes perception. It informs behavior. And over time, it can become corrosive. For Nick Reiner, that environment may have created a sense of isolation and moral pressure. He was surrounded by authority, expectation, and unspoken truths, yet lacked the means to verify, confront, or intervene. Every interaction in that household may have been filtered through suspicion, fear, or belief that wrongdoing had occurred and could not be addressed. And when belief hardens without verification, the potential for catastrophic action increases. We do not know exactly what Nick Reiner believed. We may never know. But even partial belief, repeated over years, can shape behavior, inform decisions, and alter the trajectory of relationships. And here we arrive at the essential tension: belief versus evidence. Eastwood's claim introduces a perspective previously absent from public discourse. It forces the question: if Nick Reiner acted on belief, and that belief was shaped by long-standing silence and observed patterns, what is the relationship between perception and action, between observation and reaction, between knowledge deferred and consequences realized? It is a complex moral and psychological calculus, and it cannot be simplified into a single narrative of good versus evil, victim versus perpetrator, parent versus child. Nor can it be understood without examining the role of the adults who observed but did not act. Because the tragedy did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged in a web of relationships, observations, and unspoken knowledge. Every adult who saw warning signs, suspected misconduct, or observed patterns but chose inaction, intentionally or unintentionally, became part of the context in which the son eventually acted. This is where the story moves beyond crime and accusation. It becomes an exploration of human behavior under constraints of silence, authority, and social expectation. It examines how morality, observation, and restraint intersect to shape outcomes in ways that are often invisible until catastrophe occurs. And yet, even with Eastwood's revelation, questions remain unanswered. How much did others know? When did they know it? What decisions were made to protect reputation over intervention? And how did those decisions contribute to the trajectory that led to the night of the murders? The answers are difficult, perhaps impossible, to determine with certainty. But the questions themselves illuminate the broader narrative, a narrative that includes decades of accumulation, perception, and the consequences of deferred action. Because when you examine the Reiner family through this lens, the violence of that night is no longer the starting point. It is the culmination, the endpoint of pressures, beliefs, and silences that had been building for years. And it raises another, more unsettling consideration. If the acts Eastwood alleges are true, repeated, observed, and long concealed, then they provide context, though not justification, for the son's eventual reaction. They demonstrate the power of belief, perception, and long-term psychological accumulation in shaping behavior. And that is why this story is so difficult to contain. It challenges everything we think we know about tragedy, family, and responsibility. It forces us to reconsider the boundaries of culpability, the effects of silence, and the consequences of deferred action. Because in households like this, power is enforced quietly, norms are maintained subtly, and violations, when unspoken, accrue weight over time, bending perception, shaping belief, and, in some cases, leading to outcomes that are irreversible. And as we proceed through this story, we will continue to trace these patterns, examining the intersections of belief, observation, and action to understand how a sequence of private, quiet choices ultimately collided with public catastrophe. The accusation made by Clint Eastwood did more than implicate Rob Reiner. It reframed the moral and emotional architecture of the household entirely. Because once you introduce the possibility of repeated violations, unspoken patterns, and long-held awareness, the focus shifts. It shifts from a single act to decades of context. From one night to an entire family dynamic. From the son's violent act to the environment that shaped his perceptions. And that is precisely why understanding the household itself is critical. The Reiner household, according to those who knew them, was structured on layers of authority and observation. Rob Reiner was not only a parent, but a figure whose professional and personal reputation demanded deference. His presence was commanding, even in subtle ways, and his authority extended into the moral and emotional fabric of the home. Michelle Reiner, by contrast, served as the stabilizing counterbalance. She maintained order, mediated conflict, and kept appearances. Yet, in that stabilizing role, she may have been forced to negotiate silence constantly. The very act of preserving peace and reputation required deferring difficult conversations, avoiding confrontation, and containing observations that might destabilize the household. It is in this quiet negotiation of boundaries that the seeds of tragedy, if Eastwood's claim is accurate, may have been planted. Nick Reiner grew up in this environment, observing, internalizing, interpreting. He was never the public figure, never the center of acclaim, but always close enough to see the patterns and the power. Every interaction he had, every moment of tension, every unspoken warning, contributed to a perception of imbalance, injustice, or violation. And living under that perception for years, without recourse or guidance, can shape cognition in profound ways. It can distort the line between what is assumed and what is real, between belief and certainty, between perceived threat and objective truth, which is why Eastwood's timing matters so much. He waited decades to speak. He did not intervene earlier, at a time when patterns could have been questioned or challenged. He observed, measured, and protected, believing that silence served the family. But when violence finally erupted, that same silence became part of the context of the event. Silence, in this narrative, is not neutral. It is both shield and weight. And it intersects with belief in ways that are almost impossible to disentangle. If Nick Reiner believed, even partially, that misconduct had occurred, that belief shapes perception and action. Even if the events he perceived were incomplete, misinterpreted, or unverified, the belief becomes a lens through which every interaction is filtered. Every dinner, every conversation, every seemingly minor slight is amplified and given significance. And when the cumulative pressure of decades-long belief collides with action, the consequences can be catastrophic. But here's another layer that complicates the story further: the external environment. Hollywood, the industry, the network of friends and associates, all create an implicit ecosystem of observation and influence. Within that ecosystem, reputation matters enormously. Authority figures are protected. Boundaries are often tacit. In this context, silence is reinforced by social and professional pressures. Questioning a respected figure is discouraged. Raising concerns may carry personal or professional cost. And that dynamic extends beyond the household. It shapes perception, informs behavior, and can constrain intervention. So when Eastwood speaks decades later, he is not just naming acts. He is exposing a pattern that implicates both personal relationships and the social systems surrounding them. He is suggesting that the environment itself, the combination of authority, silence, and perception, contributed to the outcome. It is a difficult concept to process because it challenges conventional understandings of culpability. We are conditioned to look for single actors, discrete events, and clear cause and effect. But in this story, the causality is distributed, layered, and decades long. This is why the Reiner household is central to understanding the narrative. Not just as a physical space, but as a psychological ecosystem. A place where power, observation, belief, and silence interacted over years to create the conditions in which tragedy could unfold. And the tragic events of that night, the murders, the arrest, the charges, are not the origin story. They are the endpoint of a long, invisible accumulation of tension, perception, and moral compromise. Which brings us to another critical tension: accountability. If decades of observation, awareness, and silence shaped the environment in which Nick Reiner acted, then the question of responsibility expands beyond the immediate actor. It includes those who observed but did not speak, those